Hello and welcome back for another episode of Write America. This literary series was dreamed up by author Roger Rosenblatt in an effort to bridge this great divide in our country through readings and conversations from award-winning, nationally renowned authors and new and emerging writers. My name is Lauren and I will be your host for the evening. If you're not familiar with us, Book Review is Long Island's largest independent bookstore. We have a great episode for you tonight featuring readings from writers Gregory Pardlo and Robert Lipsyte. In case you missed last week's episode with Ishmael Reed and Jean Hand-Korelitz or any of the previous episodes of Write America, you can go to Book Review's Crowdcast channel and watch the recordings at any time. Tonight's episode will also be recorded, so if you missed something and you want to go back and watch the replay, or if you know somebody who would love it and they just couldn't be here tonight, you can use the same link that got you here this evening to access the replay. Now, before we get started with the readings, there's just a couple of things about Crowdcast that I would like to show you so you know how it works. First off, there is a button right down here below the stream. If you click that button, it will bring you to bookreview.com where you can purchase signed book-plated copies of Gregory and Robert's books. There is also a button down here that says ask a question. If a question pops into your mind for Greg or Bob during the event, you can just drop it right down below and we'll get to it at the end. There is also a chat feature. So I see that some of you have found the chat bar. So please feel free to talk amongst yourselves, drop your questions in there, and of course, your emoji applause. So all that said and done, we're going to get started. Our first reader tonight is Gregory Pardlo. Gregory is the author of the poetry collection Digest, which won the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. His other honors include fellowships from the New York Public Library's Cullman Center, the Guggenheim Foundation, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts for Translation. His poetry collection Totem won the APR Honickman Prize in 2007. He is a poetry editor of Virginia Quarterly Review and director of the MFA program at Rutgers University Camden. Please welcome to the screen Gregory Pardlo. Hi.
Hey, hi, Lauren.
Thanks you so much for thanks for being here with us. I'm so excited to hear what you have for us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks to Book Review, and thanks to Roger, of course, for the fantastic idea and the great spirit behind this series. So I'm gonna share some fairly new work. I apologize in advance for making you all my guinea pigs here. I'm going to start with a poem. In 1951, an African-American man who was a farm owner in North Carolina, he owned his own land. He was charged with assault with intent to rape. And there's something very fascinating about this case. Then you will hear, hopefully it'll become kind of unclear as the poem goes on. And I say that because I think one of the things that fascinates me about white supremacy is its constant need to revise itself in order to rationalize its obvious illogic. And so we hear this rabid backlash against the boogeyman of critical race theory, which is any number of things and this kind of abstract threat. And I think the threat really is a threat to the convolutions of history that protect our national self-delusion of some kind of pure history. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying this case of 1951 strikes me as particularly emblematic of a very unique American fear. The title is Law and Order, and I'm going to read to you the Superior Court judge's instructions to the jury. This is Superior Court Judge Frank Armstrong's instructions in 1952. If by intentional threats or menace of some violence, such as looking at a person in a leering manner, that is, in some sort of sly or threatening or suggestive manner, watching one and then following one, he causes another to reasonably apprehend imminent danger, and by such conduct causes one to become frightened and run, or causes one to do otherwise than he would have done, then he is guilty of assault. So just imagine being in the jury and hearing that instruction. You'd be real clear on the law, right? Law and order. From the court's and 17-year-old Miss Willa Jean Boswell's perspectives, everything will have happened as she describes it, and as the prosecutor will have advised her to describe it for the Yanceyville jury when this third of 4 trials adjourns. She's telling it like she told her father and brothers. Matt Ingram's jalopy appeared on the plantation road she took to join them, Daddy and them, in the field. They was picking tobacco, she say, one of the many facts that will be true in each trial as it was that day of June in 1951. True as her dungarees and plaid shirt, the broad hat under which her hair, the long-handled hoe shouldered like a rifle for the fields, where she, that particular morning, was bound. Ingram hung his whole head out the window as he drove by, she is about to say. Real slow like, barely any dust up. He never done like that before. She may be remembering how Ingram vanished when he drove around the bend, when she heard his engine go dead, and she ran for the safety of her kin. She didn't see him leave the car, she can't say, but there he was, in the field, so close, maybe, the prosecutor will have helped her reckon, 70 feet or so. Like, say, from the doors of the church to the organ. Ingram stopped at some plum bushes, watched her in silence, the judge prompts. She knows Mac, as everybody calls him, as a good Negro, a reputation that requires a talent for being present and absent at once. The only way a man like him could imagine a fate beyond sharecropping, scrubbing uppity traces of plot from his life story to show he had no designs on the history that belongs to law-abiding men. That's why his leer, her testimony in the 4th trial will record it as a leer, was so menacing, she will have meant to say, shaken, weeping, still scared. As everyone knows, Ingram will be charged with assault with intent to rape. Less certain is that on appeal, 2 years from now, he'll be sentenced to time served. His innocence will have been proven irrelevant. His family, wife, 9 children, bankrupted, dispossessed, dispersed. At this point in her story, Ingram knows he's still searching for Mr. Boswell, hoping to borrow a trailer, as he has often done, for the last time. Knows he will leave his car and find some shade where he can scan the field. He can even see himself in Willa Jean's story, wondering, who is that strange boy with the hoe? And where is he off to in such a hurry? So following that kind of obsession, my obsession du jour, thinking a lot about white supremacy, the logic of white supremacy, that is, the illogic of it, the kinds of acrobatics it takes, rhetorical acrobatics it requires in order to justify itself. And there's this story, you may have seen this poem. This professional wrestler, well, first of all, in professional wrestling, the agreement among wrestlers is called kayfabe. And it's like I think it's Pig Latin for fake. And it's the agreement that you will always stay in character, and when somebody hits you with a chair, you'll flail about, and everyone will believe that the performance is real. And so I saw this as a larger frame for this particular incident in, I think it was 99. The wrestler Owen Hart was making this dramatic entrance from the ceiling of the stadium, and his contraption broke and he fell to his death, but was tragic, of course. And what was kind of in a distance fascinating about it was the fact that people in the audience didn't know whether or not that was still part of the show. This is called Allegory. Professional wrestler Owen Hart embodied his own omen when he battled gravity from rafters to canvas in a Kansas City stadium. Like a great tent collapsing, he fell without warning. No hoverboard, no hummingbird's finesse for the illusion of flight, no suspension of disbelief to hammock his burden, the birth of virtue in its virtual reality. His angelic entrance eclipsed when his safety harness failed. He fell out of the air sats like a wax wing duped by infinities conjured in a squeegee's mirage. Spectators wilted as the creature of grief emerged to graze on their sapling gasps and shrieks. I'd like to think that, freed of self-hype, he realized his mask was not a shield, and that he didn't spend his last attempting to method Zeno's proofs. EMTs like evangelicals huddled to jolt the hub of Hart's radiating soul as fans prayed the stunt might yet parade the emperor's threads wrestlers call kayfabe. Kayfabe, a dialect of Pig Latin, lingo for the promise to drop at the laying on of hands, to take myth as history, semblance as creed, a grift so convincing, one might easily believe it could work without someone else pulling the strings. So I, along those lines, I've been fascinated by witchcraft and witch hunting. I've become a medievalist, a general medievalist all of a sudden, because I see the fear and the judicial rationalization of fear that occurred, throughout the Inquisition, throughout witch hunting, that kind of this kind of through line, this consistent thread of rationale, institutionalizing the fear of men and the projection of that fear on some less powerful target. And so we see that in medieval times, and we see that very clearly today in the extrajudicial killing of Black men and women. That's why the poem now. This poem is called The Cult, and it's about the figure of Tituba, who was the woman during the Salem witch trials who confessed to being a witch and gave the names of several other so-called witches, and she was the one who survived. Tituba actually survived when so many others were hung and executed. A cult. Tituba was an enslaved woman, by the way. A cult. Zero your scales to the burden of a lash, dear justice. But let Tituba clumsy the magistrate's minds with a wag of her wizened index. A flight risk near the forests of the Wampanoag, where Christians savaged Queen Weetamo's corpse. What else might Tituba, non-white and woman, haunt but a margin of error? She's a catbird song trapped in the chimney. She's egg whites in water. She is the tumescence of smoke. Dear Mami Wata, let Tituba prove to be the stone that splits the stream of their vision. Let her renounce sight and be unseen. Let her cough ground coral in the shedding of a pewter moon, that she, of all the innocents, should live. Dear three-headed Hecate, replace her, the unthought thought, with wax, twigs, horsehair, and straw. Let her not appear as a witness, nor as evidence. As with the talking dog, let her be the hoodoo that speaks through their mirrors. Let a long-tailed avocado ghost the floorboards, tempting a red cat, his familiars, the devil, and his counsel, the canary. Let her conjure the man in black they fear, who charms pilgrims on the road to paradise disguised as a harmless bird watcher. Dear Nemesis, let her feed the court a few names from his register, a taste of her truth, her mise en abîme, her one hell that calls forth another. With no standing on her own behalf, let her sit in judgment. Let this power invested of gavel and oath help her give birth through her mouth like a god. All right, I'm going to read just a couple more poems here. One more kind of nun poem. And this is about Teresa Avila and Bernini's sculpture of her. Some of you may remember the meme of Lindsay Lohan. Lindsay Lohan, there's a picture of her. She's drunk and passed out. She's got a hoodie on in her car. And someone made a meme, the picture of Lindsay Lohan on one side, and on the other side, there's a picture of Bernini's Teresa Avila, and they look identical. Doesn't have a whole lot to do with the poem, but it's a passing reference, and maybe so as you're not confused as to what the joke is. The title of the poem is Nunsploitation. But this seed dibble and cautery tool, blushing for the fever mad, this marble and bronze opera, idols, an engine of reverence, and the tourist economy Bernini has distilled as ecstasy. This live electric, this tantric sneeze. Could Bernini have rendered a pleasure not got at the end of a spear? The highest angel haunted Teresa Avila like a Motown hook and prodded her body quiverish with love's heartburn, a rapture fantasy fathomed by her innermost yoga, her spirit let open like a sack of lightning bugs. To complement the head lull and hoodie of a starlet's bender slept off in agony glorioso, Bernini lifted Teresa's story like a shipwreck from its ecclesiastical groove and mimicked her signature miracle, levitation, which she murmured into her sackcloth and wimple. He left Teresa's left foot exposed, as if to bait a bedside tidbit, the devil, for whom she had no fear, for he appeared to her toy-sized and black, and dropped by to make her pound air with laughter, all weightless, all risen by pinch and tickle, until she wet him with holy water. Ecstasy then, this cliffhanger, this mercy of exaltation and taboo. So I think I'm gonna wrap up there.
Thank you so much, Greg. I have to say, I just looked up the Lindsay Lohan and Bernini meme. It is uncanny how similar they look. It's really good. Oh my goodness. So we'll see you a little bit later for the conversation. Thank you so much, Greg.
Okay.
Okay, so up next we have a reading for Robert Lipsyte. Bob was an award-winning sports writer for the New York Times and the Emmy-winning host of the nightly public affairs show The 11th Hour. He is the author of 12 acclaimed novels for young adults and is the recipient of the Margaret A. Edwards Award, honoring his lifetime contribution to the YA genre. Please welcome to your screen, Robert Lipsyte. Hi, Bob.
I'm sorry, Lauren. I don't think I can go on after that. That poetry just kind of blew me into another place. But thank you very much for your introduction. Also, thank you to Roger Rosenblatt. I'm here on Shelter Island, which is on the very tip of the east end of Long Island. And the best writer on Shelter Island is Jules Pfeiffer, who you will hear from a little later in this series. And every Sunday morning, Jules and I have breakfast. He makes me breakfast. And he thanks Roger Rosenblatt for having found him and placed him on Shelter Island. And so that's the only reason I'm going to try to go on, after that very powerful and interesting and different and innovative poetry, which we will have to talk about. So I went into the sports writing trade when I was 19, but I was in my 70s before I could answer that persistent question, who is your hero in sports? I was writing my memoir at the time, an accidental sports writer, reevaluating and sometimes re-interviewing every athlete I'd ever known when the obvious finally became clear. My hero in sports was my dad. My father was in his 80s when I found his high school track medals in the back of a drawer. He'd been a middle distance champion, jock. Pressed for more details, he reluctantly told me that he had quit his college track team when the coach refused to send him to an out-of-town meet because the Olympic hopeful, whom Dad had beaten all season long, was the one that the coach had decided to promote. The symbolism of those medals turned out to be a big piece of the jigsaw puzzle of my dad's life and thus of my own. Over the years, Dad had freely expressed his skepticism, even cynicism, about politics, religion, academia. Dad had opinions on everything. But he had always seemed indifferent to sports on any level, which, given his great interest in individual and mass psychology, seemed very odd to me. I wondered if he felt too intellectual for sports, or later on, if he was subtly putting down what I did for a living. He was always telling me, kind of, jesting on the square, "Oh, Bobby, take a week off and write a bestseller." I breezily reply something like, I'm sorry, Dad, I'm too busy to get rich." But it kind of felt like a needle sometimes, and sometimes it hurt. I had no idea that he was still indignant over what he considered an unfair exclusion. He thought he had won the right to go to that pre-Olympic track meet. Sports had disillusioned him, and he had believed sports was a true meritocracy. After I found out about his aborted track career, I asked him about his take on the City College scandals of 1951, in which basketball players conspired with gamblers to fix the outcomes of games. Dad graduated from City in 1927. He told me that he thought most of life, as well as sports, was fixed, though not as blatantly as those basketball games have been. In most cases, he said, it's about the wrong people getting the chance to play for, quote, political reasons. He said that we need to make sure everybody gets an equal chance to play on a level field, and then it's up to them. This was a running theme throughout his life. Most of his career was in underserved, that was his word, underserved districts of New York City, teaching and administering in schools for what were then officially designated as, quote, socially maladjusted boys. He lived to salvage those boys. The world might see them as juvenile delinquents, but in his writings, Dad called them, quote, inadequately protected children, whose, quote, disturbances had been caused and exacerbated at home and in previous schools where they were embarrassed and punished. He wanted to offer them an atmosphere of masculine authority where their self-esteem would be boosted. He was hardly a leftist or even a bleeding heart by any modern labeling standards. And I am ashamed that in my spoiled salad days, I called him a colonialist. He was an all-American centrist, Give people a fair shake by making sure they have a pair of boots so they can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Boots to Dad meant shelter, health care, food, education, and psychological support. After that, they were responsible for themselves. Dad always felt responsible for himself. I think his worldview began to take shape in the Bronx in 1912 when he was 8 years old and he heard the SOS calls from the Titanic on his brother's crystal radio set. A seed was planted in his mind. If the supposedly unsinkable Titanic could go down, could you ever again put faith in technology or in the officials who misspoke with such authority? When his father died in the flu epidemic a few years later, another seed was planted. Even God could not be relied on to do the right thing. Yet Dad was an optimist. He believed things could be made better and that he could be part of the solution. But he took nothing for granted, and neither did I. When disaster struck, from illness in the family to carnage on the evening news, I'd call him up. In 1963, when President Kennedy was murdered, I called Dad to make sure he was okay. I mean, the old man was pushing 60. I called him after 9/11 to make sure I was okay. After all, I was in my 60s. He was 100 years old, a widower, living alone. Dad would tell me to relax. He'd say, don't let your imagination loose unless you're writing fiction. Nothing is ever quite as good as you imagine it will be, or as bad. When I was younger, there seemed something kind of bittersweet, disappointed, even defeatist about that. But now it feels more like, never give up. We can get through this. After all, Dad was saying without saying, look, I'm still here. Well, now he's not. But I'm still talking to him, taking both sides of the conversation. He'd have been very interested, but not surprised, about the housing bust, the oil spills, climate change, the latest Wall Street greed implosion, Trump, the attack on the Capitol. I tell him, thanks to you, Dad, I've been shocked, but never surprised. He was very proud when I started writing for the paper, but when the name Lipsyte first appeared in the New York Times, it was his name. On June 28, 1936, 2 years before I was born. The headline read, Bronx man, also Victor. Sidney Lipsyte gets $400 for article. Dad had won first place in a Times essay contest on the Constitution as a living document. He told me he had written it overnight at the urging of his principal. Dad was a junior high school English teacher at the time. In the Times story announcing his prize, he said he was going to use the money, which was no small change in those days, to travel. He didn't. He bought 1/3 of an acre some 50 miles from Queens in upstate New York and began to build a house, much of it himself. So he knew that writing could pay off. And he always encouraged my writing, sometimes a little too vigorously. He had lots of ideas on how to make my junior high school science fiction stories more exciting. We struggled for creative control. At the time, I thought it was parental bigfooting, and I was resentful. Years later, when he showed me short stories he had written for school magazines about the imp of the universe and his henchmen, time on his hands and mischief on his mind, I realized that he was living a dream through me, and I was proud. Knowing that, I have felt more comfortable allowing myself to live my dreams through my son Sam's fiction and my daughter Susanna's social consciousness and activism. I loved visiting Dad at work, particularly during the years he was principal of one of those hard schools. He strode those halls like Captain Kirk on the bridge of the Enterprise, although he would have preferred C.S. Forrester's Horatio Hornblower or Patrick O'Brien's Jack Aubrey, a beloved and respected power figure. The rough boys would vie for his attention. Several times I saw him wallop kids on the butt for some infraction. The boys would grin at him as if thrilled by the caring attention they got nowhere else. They would promise to behave and swagger off. When he loosened up enough, we were both old men by that time, to tell me his stories. One of his favorites was of his first command at 44. He was appointed principal of an elementary school near the Brooklyn Navy Yard in 1948. That school was already old when he took it over. He spent much of the summer before classes began roaming the ancient vessel. One day, he discovered a sagging wall in the basement. He was physically strong and fearless, and he pushed the wall over to reveal a huge tiled room, the walls and ceilings festooned with rusted pipes. In old school records, he discovered that a shower room had been built for a local immigrant community that had no hot running water. Taking advantage of the brief window of accommodation that incoming principals get, he persuaded the district to hire plumbers and restore the shower room for a student body that still could not wash itself on a regular basis. To remove any stigma, he created the Swim Club and promoted its logo, a fish, as if it were a varsity letter or gang colors. Kids wanted to wear that white cotton fish patch pinned to their shirts, members only of a club whose sole admission requirement was needing a hot shower. When I came to realize how much he had meant to me, I was sad that we hadn't met earlier in that warm and emotional place we found ourselves in mutual old age. But I'm glad we had time enough for me to discover and appreciate my only true hero in sports. No one else ever came close. Thank you.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you. Wow. So I had some suggestions early on before we came on about what we might talk about, but I think all I want to talk about is dads. I have had a difficult relationship with my father, and he was a big sports fan, as I mentioned to you earlier, and he would talk about my writing poetry as the one thing. His big comment was, who wins in poetry? How do you know when you win in poetry? Right, in sports, you know when you win. It's the guy who crosses. It's always the guy, right? It's the guy who crosses the finish line first. It's the guy who's standing over the other guy in the ring, looking down on him triumphantly, right? That we know who wins, but that's, given your story, it's clearly not true, right? So how do we place ourselves in a kind of ethical framework when we know that it's all poetry? A little abstract question for you.
So was he a strict father? Was he a distant father?
Oh yeah, definitely. He was an air traffic controller, and he was in strike in 1981 when he went on strike, and Reagan fired them all. And, his kind of commitment, similarly to as you described your father, his commitment to this idea that one can, by grit and will and perseverance, overcome, right, or lift oneself up by the bootstraps. And I just didn't buy it because I had seen the president fire him, right? I had seen the entire sort of government apparatus undermine his every effort at securing a future and stability for his family. So I don't know. And I guess I admire, on the one hand, I admire men like our fathers who, have this sort of belief. I don't want to say futile, but certainly a commitment to a sense of meritocracy, given the fact that so much evidence in their lives and so much experience tells them otherwise. So I don't know. I guess I turn to writing because I know that it's all kind of imagined and it's all created. And I wonder if that, what role does writing play for you as a means of articulating a philosophy of life?
That's why you turn to writing?
Yeah. Yeah, it's not quite as romantic as people like to think about, poetry. But yes, I turn to poetry because what I'm after in poetry is making all of the structures that are otherwise invisible, visible, right? To defamiliarize the world in a way that we can see it, to defamiliarize our, customs and habits of thought, our social assumptions, so that we can see them. And to point out how arbitrary and constructed all of this is, how contrived all of this is, right? And I think part of my father's commitment to this sense of truth and meritocracy came from his indoctrination through Hollywood. He deeply believed in Hollywood movies and that narrative that always has this kind of resolved payoff. But poetry for me was a way to kind of thumb my nose at all of those conventions and while playing into them in some regards, but also saying, this is, as I say, contrived just like anything else.
I wish I had become a writer for such high level of philosophical understanding. I was a fat kid, and nothing is better for a fat kid than go into a corner and write stories in which skinny people died horribly. So, but I admit, but when did you come to some of these thoughts? How old were you?
Yeah, I don't think we're terribly far off, because I think my my early impulses toward poetry were well, of course, there was a little bit of cynicism there. I think early on I was kind of taken enchanted by the beauty of language and all of that. But when I started taking writing seriously, it was because I was inspired by Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison and the kind of literary hero of James Baldwin. Obviously, the literary heroes who did something, right, who did something intellectually with the culture, right, as opposed to there's a very strong and necessary place for people to marching in the streets with placards and for people with direct political action and social action. But I felt like I had abilities to do something socially and politically that were, for lack of a better term, intellectual. And so it wasn't until I started taking writing seriously that's what was motivating me. So I would say in my late 20s probably is when I started thinking about changing the world with poetry.
Yeah. But it's interesting that my son teaches at Columbia, and he was there at that magical time. Now, you were taking courses in nonfiction writing, and you won the Pulitzer Prize in poetry, which was like, the angels said, "Hey, Greg, I think we know what you should be doing." So you were ready. Were you ready to leave poetry at that point?
No, I didn't. I wanted to explore other genres of writing. Well, to put it simply, I had this story about the strike, the air traffic control strike, and I've been trying to write it for 20 years. And I wanted to study. I realized I wanted to study labor history, and I wanted to think deeply about all of the social, context around the strike, and not just to tell a story about my dad, which is ultimately what any good story is, right? Is telling a story about my dad. But I saw the opportunity to go to Columbia and study with Philip Lopate and have this writing structure that would allow me to explore what it meant to write nonfiction and memoir. So I wasn't necessarily giving up, and at any rate, my poems were very often long poems, and I consider them
story poems.
Story, yeah, and clearly very taken by history and argumentation. And so the essay didn't seem a far cry from what I was doing. But yeah, it was it was a surprise. This odd moment. What do you think?
Somebody put up a question. Do either of us have sisters? And I was wondering whether we're being accused of being male chauvinist pigs here or something. Or what does that mean? Do you have sisters?
I do not. I have a much younger, a 10-year younger brother, and I suspect part of that question is because it's what would be interesting to me anyway. If I were asking that question, I would be curious to know how this very large part of our social and political lives plays into our sense of meritocracy, our sense of, because I think a lot of what we've been talking about is kind of overdetermined by masculinity and I was cracking up. You thought of your father as a colonizer, right? And I think there is a lot of that kind of discourse even in our conversation right now. So I appreciate the question, and it's kind of what this book that I'm working on now is after. Right? When I'm masking it by saying I'm interested in witches and witch hunting, but I'm really the secret in the book, in the manuscript, is that I'm really interested in the persecution of my mother, right? My father's persecution of my mother and her alien, incredibly talented woman, and the ways that she was prevented from expressing herself and pursuing her art. And I'm reluctant to say the sacrifice, because that's too easy, because she did throw herself into taking care of me and my brother. But yeah, I appreciate the question at any rate.
Yeah, well, I don't. And let me tell you, I do have a sister, and she's a Jungian analyst, and she's going to check you out.
How many siblings do you have?
Oh, now Nell Painter is saying, I asked the question about sisters in complete innocence. I just wanted to know. Yeah, right. There is no complete innocence. Haven't you been listening to us? Thank you for the question.
Oh, that's funny. So you do have a Jungian analyst in the family, though. That's got to be disconcerting. Can you have a family get together?
Yeah, it's tough at holidays, right? And we do a Zoom, a family Zoom every Saturday at 2:00. The whole family gets together.
Wow.
And more she's been running it. So, and we all feel like we're on couches surrounding her.
Yeah, yeah. You don't, have you taught? Have you taught?
Have I taught?
You taught. Have you been a teacher?
NYU?
You teach at NYU
Am I
now?
missing your question?
Yeah. Have you taught in the classroom? Because I know you. Right. Yeah. So you write for the New York Times, but I didn't know if you were also a teacher.
I have taught at NYU and at Wake Forest, and it was wonderful, and it really I think helped my writing in the sense that I was asked tough questions. There was one period when I was writing a column, and I was teaching column writing at NYU, and I would have to go into the class, and they said, "Why did you write that column? Why did you pick that subject?" And I couldn't say, "Well, it's because I didn't want to shave that day. I wanted to sit home." And I think things like that, people really put you on your toes. Do you find that it helps your poetry?
I do. Yeah. For the exact same reason, I think, and that is the innocent questions that are without guile and subterfuge are nonetheless, disarming, right? Because it just kind of points out all the things that I take for granted and assume, right? We rely on cultural assumptions. Of course, everybody knows this, and it's a lazy way of avoiding thinking. And those questions make me justify the decisions that I make, and take responsibility for the decisions that I make, right? And that ultimately, I think, definitely makes me a better writer, because it makes me more attentive to the way I'm.
It's a wonderful. It's like having a moral check.
Yeah. Like having a Jungian in the family.
But it must be hard teaching poetry. I mean, you can teach appreciation for poetry, but you can't. It seems hard to make somebody a poet.
No, it's not. Sense? Yes, of course it makes sense. I have this argument all the time that I love wading into this argument, and I think. Because poetry is just a set of conventions, right? And we have, again, kind of mystified the poetry to be this, inspired by muses, and it's otherworldly. And no, it's just a set of cultural conventions, and you learn how to apply those cultural conventions. The trick, however, is being expressive within those cultural conventions. Right. So how do we inspire someone to think independently within the cultural conventions? Right. How do we first recognize them, and then how do we think independently within them? And when we get those distinctions kind of clarified, it's just I don't mean to simplify it, but it's just the imagination working. And you mentioned you called my work different, I think was the adjective you used, and I love that, because what I'm always teaching is, and encouraging my students, is to write like nobody else, is to write like only you can.
Well, you've achieved that. There's no question. And as an Columbia English major, who I read, 60 years ago, and to see not only breaking with the canon, but breaking past your real rivals these days, which is music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Songwriters.
Yeah.
And rappers, and it's kind of poetry needs to steal it back, bring it back, and you do that.
Well, I appreciate it. I am wary. So what my parents would always say is, "Why don't you go write a greeting card and make $1 million?" Or as your father saying, write a bestseller. So yeah, I'm conscious of the need to say something to the public, and it's a balance, right? Between being generous to a reader and being true to your own imagination.
Yeah.
Yeah. What we all kind of struggle with. Further.
All right.
Hey.
Hi. So we
Hi.
have a question here from George Colt and Ann Fadiman. They wrote, Gregory has written an extraordinary poem about a professional wrestler. Robert, have you ever written about professional wrestling or interviewed a wrestler?
Yes, I absolutely have, including the fabulous Moolah. But I think that I have never brought what Greg has brought into it. I think that he in a sense, took us behind the emotional and mental story, because the idea that wrestling is well, as my father would say, fixed, but it's beyond being fixed. It's a performance art, and but I mean, just in Greg's choosing a subject like that, which certainly is not a common subject for fair poesy. I think is part of what we've been enjoying and seeing in his work, is this kind of breaking loose, this kind of reveling in no boundaries. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't have any boundaries, do you? I'm glad you're not trying to write sonnets. My God.
I can wield a sonnet. I can roll a sonnet down
there. Now, I guess I have a couple of questions for you. Greg, has the pandemic, having to quarantine, has it made you more or less creative? Have you been writing more over the past year, or has it kind of slowed down for you?
Well, both. I'm the half empty side is it's slowed me down because I'm doing more Zoom stuff. I feel like I'm even busier than I've ever been, right? Because there are meeting after meeting after meeting. It's in 4 meetings today, and doing administrative stuff that I just never would have allowed myself to do were we on campus. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in that sense, we're all the more accessible online, and and that just makes it's anathema to the hermitage of writing poetry.
Right. Now, Bob, what was your favorite sport to cover?
Boxing.
Boxing.
Boxing been very, very good to me. Yeah, for 2 reasons. One, because I think that writers, I'm sure Greg would feel the same, writers kind of consider themselves much like boxers, in the sense that you train in isolation for a long period of time. Then you put your work out before the public. You're half naked, and very good, very bad things could happen, or you could have a tie. So I love that, and I love the fact that when I was just starting out, and a fighter named Cassius Clay came on the scene, and it was thought that he would be knocked out very quickly. And the Times did not want to waste the time of a real important boxing writer, And they said, send the kid to cover Cassius Clay. The kid's not doing anything. I was the kid. And of course, in the best career move anybody ever made for me, Cassius Clay won the heavyweight champion, became Muhammad Ali, and became my story. And I became the boxing writer.
Wow.
So I've loved that aspect of two men. Although I must say now, certainly now, but for a long time, I see no socially acceptable reason for two people, man or woman, to go into a ring and beat the crap out of each other. I think it's a terrible sport. I think mixed martial arts is even worse. And I have bad things to say about football too. But I think that, I know that the real competition and blood and guts is in poetry. I mean, those guys are tough.
That's why poets are most often great tennis players.
That's my sport. Yeah. I'm a tennis player. I used to be. Not so much anymore.
Yeah. My dear friend Ricardo Phillips wrote a fantastic book called The Circuit, where he followed from his couch. He followed the tennis circuit around the globe 1 year, and he's a brilliant sports writer as a poet. Yeah.
And then I guess we can finish with this. What are you reading right now? What's on your nightstand?
Oh boy. I'm reading Matthew Salisse. Well, a couple of things. I have Paisley Rekdal's Appropriate. It's a book about cultural appropriation, the poet writing cultural theory. And Matthew Salise's, I don't have the book handy. It's a book on craft, on the writing craft. I wish I knew the title offhand. Yeah. Well,
spoiler alert, we might see a reading from Paisley in the third round of Write America, so look out for that. And what about you, Bob? What are you reading right now?
Well, I'm writing a new book now, so I'm trying not to read anything too involving. But since the beginning of the pandemic, so almost a year and a half now, every single day in the afternoon, I read to my 8, he became 9-year-old grandson, and we read the books, remarkably interesting books by a writer named Rick Riordan, Percy Jackson, and the Olympians. And we've read 19 books over this period of time, and we discuss them. And I'm always shocked by how sophisticated they are in their way. First, the gods make terrible parents, and half of the gods are either bisexual or gender fluid. And so, an 83-year-old man explaining this to a 9-year-old boy is probably a sitcom.
Yeah, and getting almost Princess Bride vibes from that. Yeah, no, those books are very fun. Those are great books for kids. Don't sleep on middle grade and YA literature. There's some good stuff out there. But I think this is a great place to end. I want to thank both of you so much for being here. Greg and Robert, thank you so much for participating in Write America. Thank you to everybody who tuned in tonight. And of course, to our friend Roger Rosenblatt for dreaming this whole thing up. Don't forget to click the button right below the stream here or visit bookreview.com to get your hands on signed copies of Greg and Robert's books. And I hope to see you right back here next Monday at 7 o'clock for another episode of Write America with writers Kate Lehrer, Elizabeth Hawes-Weinstock, and David Toma Martinez. So until next week. Yep. See you then. Bye, everyone.
Bob, it was great meeting you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.